When Alexander the Great advanced into the Indian subcontinent, his goal was clear: to extend his already vast empire. However, at the Battle of Hydaspes, he encountered a formidable challenge from the Indian King Porus, who had different plans. In 327 BCE, Alexander's army entered the Indian subcontinent through the Khyber and Pirsar passes. His progress was marked by fierce resistance, yet he managed to overcome opposition despite being heavily outnumbered. After reaching the region now known as Punjab, Alexander dispatched messages to the local rulers demanding their submission. While many complied, Porus the Elder, a powerful Indian king, refused and rallied his forces to confront Alexander on the battlefield. Alexander's approach was strategic. He sent envoys ahead of his army, urging the rulers of the region to pledge their allegiance or face destruction. During this time, he gained the support of Taxila's ruler, a key ally. This Indian king, known to the Macedonians as Taxiles or Omphis, had first established contact with Alexander through an ambassador in Sogdiana. Now, as Alexander entered the Indian territories, Taxiles met him, swore loyalty, and offered lavish gifts. At Taxila, Alexander's army rested while he finalized his campaign strategy. In return for his allegiance, Taxiles received numerous gifts from Alexander, along with new territories that expanded his rule. However, not all regional leaders were as welcoming. Taxiles himself had reasons for aligning with Alexander. He was embroiled in a bitter conflict with his powerful rival, Porus. Porus, or Poros, ruled a kingdom located between the Jhelum, Hydaspes, and Chenab, Hydaspes rivers, reportedly encompassing over 300 cities. While Indian records do not mention him, Macedonian sources provide insights into his reign. What is certain is that Porus was a strong, determined leader who viewed Alexander's arrival with hostility. Years earlier, Porus had assassinated Taxiles' uncle, intensifying the enmity between the two rulers. When Alexander demanded Porus's submission, the Indian king refused outright and began preparing for war. For Alexander, this defiance was unacceptable. Allowing Porus to remain unchecked risked emboldening other rulers to resist, undermining the stability of his conquests. A confrontation between the two was inevitable. The armies assembled for the Battle of Hydaspes were a remarkable blend of cultures and military traditions. At the heart of Alexander's forces were his Macedonian infantry, supported by troops gathered during his campaigns across Asia. Notably, he had recruited horse archers from the Saka during his time in Sogdiana and Bactria. Taxiles also contributed a contingent of Indian allies. In total, Alexander's army likely numbered around 40,000 infantry and 5,000 to 7,000 cavalry, though it remains unclear how many participated in the actual battle. Estimating the size of Porus's forces is more challenging due to limited records on Indian military organization during this era. Most accounts suggest that Porus's army slightly outnumbered Alexander's, with approximately 50,000 to 54,000 troops. The majority were infantry armed with powerful longbows, supported by 2,000 to 4,000 cavalry and 1,000 chariots, which were still a prominent feature of Indian warfare. Porus's most fearsome asset, however, was his 200 war elephants, each carrying skilled archers and javelin throwers. Porus himself rode into battle atop a particularly large and imposing elephant. The two armies faced each other across the Hydaspes River, whose deep, fast-flowing waters posed a significant obstacle. Any attempt to cross in full view of the enemy would likely have resulted in disaster. Alexander spent days scouting along the riverbank, searching for a strategic point. On the opposite side, Porus's forces mirrored his movements, staying alert to any potential crossings. Eventually, Alexander identified a favorable spot where a wooded island obscured visibility. To deceive Porus, he left the bulk of his army in camp under the command of a trusted general, who created diversions to simulate preparations for a crossing. Under the cover of darkness, Alexander led 15,000 to 20,000 men across the river. By the time Porus realized what had happened, Alexander's troops were already on his side of the river. Porus acted swiftly, dispatching 2,000 cavalry and 120 chariots under his son's command to engage Alexander's forces as they attempted to complete their river crossing. To buy time for his own infantry, Alexander countered by deploying his horse archers to harass the chariots, while dividing his cavalry into multiple squadrons to encircle the Pauravas. Despite Porus's efforts, heavy rainfall had turned much of the terrain into a muddy quagmire, making it nearly impossible for the chariots to maneuver effectively. Seizing this advantage, Alexander's men quickly overwhelmed the opposing forces, killing 400 soldiers, including Porus's son, before the survivors managed to retreat to their main force. Although this skirmish resulted in losses for Porus, it successfully delayed Alexander, giving Porus time to prepare for battle. Leaving a smaller force behind to contest any crossings by Craterus, Porus concentrated the bulk of his army against Alexander. He arranged his troops with cavalry and chariots stationed on the flanks, infantry in the center, and war elephants positioned at the front. The elephants were a key part of his strategy, intended to break through Alexander's infantry formation. With Porus's army ready for combat and Alexander's element of surprise lost, the Macedonian leader regrouped his cavalry, waited for his infantry to catch up, and devised a new plan. Understanding that the elephants posed the greatest threat, Alexander decided not to attack the center immediately. Instead, he aimed to crush the enemy cavalry on the flanks first. To execute this, he split his superior cavalry forces into two groups. The larger contingent, led by Alexander himself, would attack Porus's left flank to draw in reinforcements, while the second group, under Conus, would circle around Porus's right to strike from behind. Meanwhile, Alexander's infantry advanced slowly, with strict orders not to engage until Conus's maneuver was complete. Once his men had recovered from the exhausting river crossing, Alexander launched his assault. He sent 1,000 horse archers to harass Porus's left flank, raining arrows upon the Poravian cavalry and throwing them into disarray. Taking advantage of the chaos, Alexander led his companions and the bulk of his cavalry in a flank attack. As anticipated, Porus shifted his right flank cavalry to reinforce the left, leaving them vulnerable to Conus's surprise attack. Conus executed his move perfectly, flanking the Indian right and striking the cavalry from the rear. Trapped between two forces, the Poravian horsemen crumbled under the pressure and retreated toward the safety of the elephants in the center. In response, Porus attempted to deploy his elephants against Alexander's cavalry to stabilize the left flank. However, the Macedonian horses, trained for such situations, simply pulled back out of reach of the slow-moving elephants. Meanwhile, Alexander's infantry had closed in on Porus's center, engaging a dense formation of infantry, elephants, and scattered cavalry. The elephants charged the phalanx, but Alexander had prepared his men well for this encounter. The phalanx absorbed the impact where necessary, using their long sarissas to target the mahouts and aim for the elephants' sensitive areas, such as their eyes. Light infantry and Agrianians joined the fight, launching javelins and attacking the elephants' legs and trunks with axes and swords. Despite these efforts, the elephants caused significant casualties, trampling soldiers, tossing them with their trunks, and impaling them on their tusks. It was a scene of sheer carnage. However, as the battle wore on, many of the elephants, now wounded and panicked, turned and rampaged back through Porus's infantry, inflicting even more damage on their own side. With the elephants in disarray, Alexander's cavalry resumed their assault, hitting Porus's center from the sides and rear. Meanwhile, the Macedonian phalanx pressed forward from the front, gradually encircling Porus's forces. Amid the chaos, Porus's army began to collapse, with soldiers fleeing through gaps in Alexander's cavalry. At this point, Craterus and Meleager had successfully crossed the river with their contingents and joined the pursuit of the retreating Pauravas. Despite the collapse of his army, pockets of Porus's troops fought on, with the king himself among them. Surrounded by his personal guard, Porus displayed extraordinary courage, fighting from atop his elephant and hurling javelins at the enemy. He sustained multiple wounds during the battle and nearly lost consciousness from blood loss. Impressed by Porus's bravery and resilience, Alexander sent envoys to pursue and persuade him to surrender. Severely wounded and with little choice, Porus eventually submitted and was brought before Alexander. When asked how he wished to be treated, Porus famously replied, "Treat me as a king." Alexander honored this request, having him treated by the finest physicians and restoring him as a vassal king. In time, Alexander even entrusted Porus with additional territories to govern. The Battle of Hydaspes was one of the bloodiest engagements of Alexander's career, with Macedonian casualties estimated at 200 to 1,000, exceeding those at Gaugamela. Indian losses were far greater, with some estimates suggesting around 20,000 killed. Alexander also captured approximately 150 war elephants, a valuable addition to his arsenal. Tragically, the battle also marked the loss of Bucephalus, Alexander's beloved horse, who died from wounds sustained during the fighting. In his memory, Alexander founded the city of Bucephala near the battlefield, alongside another city, Nicaea, to commemorate his victory.